Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for making time to watch this talkback. My name is Eunice Rho. I'm the Acting Director for Strategic Partnerships here at the ACLU. I just feel so lucky to be joined by three incredible people. Julie Cohen, who, of course, with Betsy West is one of the co-directors of My Name is Pauli Murray, which all of you have just watched. She also is one of the co-writers of this film. We also have with us Ria Tabacco Mar, who's the director of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, founded by none other than Justice Ginsburg in the 1970s. And last but definitely not least, one of the stars of the film, Strangio, Deputy Director for Transgender Justice here at the ACLU. I want to note that I will be referring to Pauli throughout this film as either Pauli or they, them, really while acknowledging that throughout the film, as you saw, Pauli's friends and relatives often use she, her pronouns. So I want to begin first with you, Julie. You know, I believe you and Betsy came across Pauli's story in the course of making RBG, your Oscar-nominated documentary, which I'm sure many in this audience has already seen, and if they haven't, they really should. What prompted you to embark on a documentary about Pauli's life and their story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was a process that happened in steps. As you say, while we were doing the research on our RBG doc, we did come across Pauli Murray's name on the first brief that RBG wrote for the Supreme Court, Reed v. Reed, where Ruth Bader Ginsburg had given Pauli and another lawyer and Judge Dorothy Kenyon co-author credits on a brief. If you know much about how things work in Supreme Court litigation, that is a fairly unusual thing to do. This wasn't a footnote. RBG is actually saying Pauli Murray is a co-author of this brief. Not that Pauli was actually a co-author, but RBG was acknowledging that it was Pauli Murray's ideas, Pauli's development of this concept that the 14th Amendment could be applied not only to racial equality, but to gender equality, that really was the intellectual foundation of RBG's later work. So, you know, we sort of took a little note of that. We noticed the name and noted that it wasn't, sadly for us, a name that we were familiar with, but it was really in the kind of process that you go through when you're going around promoting a film and thinking about it in all different ways, that actually a young woman lawyer at a very early screening said to us, like, I'm seeing this film, I'm realizing I stand on RBG's shoulders, and I'm just wondering whose shoulders did Ruth Bader Ginsburg stand on? And we said, you know, there's actually a quite specific answer to that. You know, there's this amazing attorney named Pauli Murray, and as we're answering this question in the Q&A, we realized that we're sort of like pitching a new film, and it led us to go to Google, as you go, because of course, Pauli died in 1985, so this isn't someone who's around to be interviewed. This isn't someone whose colleagues are all still living. But the beautiful discovery for us was that Pauli, presciently as always, had the idea of being understood better after lifetime than Pauli was understood while still living, and had collected this amazing 141 boxes worth of an archive that were not only papers, diaries, legal briefs, you know, books, book notes, but also about 40 audio tapes, and we also found separately some videotapes. So that made us say, wow, these are actually I mean, of all the ways that Pauli had foresight, one of the greatest was, like, even if the world isn't ready for my story yet, maybe they will be later. So let's save it. Let's save it here in a library at Harvard where people will discover it. Certainly, you know, we are not the discoverers of Pauli Murray. People that are deep in the field of equality law understood Pauli. Scholars, history scholars actually were quite familiar. It's really only in maybe the popular culture and in schools that we don't understand and appreciate Pauli as much as we should. So we were like, we've got the material, let's try to tell this story.
Well, I'm sure all of us are very, very grateful that you have embarked on this project, and we've so appreciated the film. I want to pose the same question to Chase and Ria, perhaps starting with you, Ria. How did you first learn about who Pauli Murray was and their body of work?
So like Julie, I'm sort of a bit embarrassed about how late in my career I was before I really came to learn about Pauli Murray and Pauli's work. For me, that time came when I was a young attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, a place where Pauli, of course, also worked. And one of the wonderful things about working at LDF is that just an organization with such a strong sense of history. At that time, we literally had Thurgood Marshall's desk sat in the office, and sometimes we had this old leaky office and it would rain outside, it would kind of rain inside, and I kept thinking, like, I really hope it doesn't rain on Thurgood Marshall's desk. But I share that story only because there was such a strong sense of history and such a profound commitment at LDF to recognizing our history and to where LDF came from, including many of the folks who were responsible for some of LDF's greatest legal victories, but who aren't often credited with them. So that includes not only Pauli Murray, but for example, Constance Baker Motley, who became the first Black woman to be a federal judge, another of the architects of the Brown versus Board of Education strategy, but nowhere near the name recognition of someone like Thurgood Marshall. And so to me, Pauli Murray was in that same camp. And I love what you said, Julie, about Pauli sort of saving their life materials for the story to be told later, because in some ways, I think the same could be said for Pauli's legal theories, right? Pauli's legal theories also, courts were not ready for Pauli's ideas when Pauli had them, but Pauli planted the seed. Pauli planted the seed in their note for the Howard Law Review that, of course, later became the strategy that was adopted in Brown versus Board of Ed. And as RBG herself said during her lifetime, it's not that her ideas were better than Pauli's. In fact, her ideas were Pauli's. It's that RBG was at what had the right time, right? So Pauli was just ahead of their time, and it was other folks who came along later who recognized the value in what Pauli had given us and were able to actually bring that to an audience that was ready to hear it. And I just wanted to add a note on that wonderful brief cover in Read v. Read, because it's often told as a lovely story about RBG and her generosity, which I think it is, but it's also, it's not just that RBG was an extraordinary co-author to recognize Pauli, it's that Pauli was such an extraordinary contributor that to have the great legal mind, to have come up with these theories, not just that the 14th Amendment also applied to sex discrimination, but of course, the notion that separate was inherently unequal also originated with Pauli. And, those are sort of the defining legal concepts of equal protection of our generation. And so it was the extraordinariness went in both directions. And I love that this pair of films has brought those two folks together. The last thing I'll just say is what a wonderful thing, Julie, that you were able to use the tapes in the film. For me, despite having known about Pauli's work for, I suppose, over a decade now, the film was the first time that I actually heard Pauli's voice. And that moment was so incredibly profound for me. I still remember the feeling of getting goosebumps running up my arm, hearing Pauli's voice for the first time and hearing Pauli's words in Pauli's voice. And just what an amazing gift you've given us by making that accessible.
Wow. Chase, I can't wait for your answer. Same question to you. How did you first learn about Pauli and their incredible life and body of work?
Yeah, so similarly, I too did not learn about Pauli until I was a lawyer, which is so troubling to think. Like, we went through our public school education, went through law school. I think maybe that's perhaps the most troubling. It wasn't until I was actually a lawyer that I learned about Pauli. And I don't have a recollection of exactly like the moment that I learned about Pauli's life and Pauli's work. It must have been such that, I integrated Pauli's existence into this sense of like, Pauli was always a part of me. I just didn't know. And it sort of reminds me of like how when people are like, well, when did you know that that you were trans? It's this like question that presumes sort of like a linearity of understanding of oneself and one's place in history. And I think that, of course, the information available to us shapes how we understand ourselves in the world. And once I knew of Pauli became so central to my life that I can't pinpoint a moment. And I actually can't imagine that my whole, like, at least legal education wasn't, directly shaped by a explicit understanding of Pauli, because, Pauli was still there constraining and expanding what was possible in my mind. But I definitely didn't learn about Pauli until I was a lawyer. And then once I did, I think I just sort of integrated Pauli into the understanding of the way in which our ancestors, the way in which the people who make our lives possible sort of create everything that we're able to do once we are aware of how much more expansive our ways of thinking can be. And that's ways of thinking about ourselves and ways of thinking about how the world might look. And so I, like Julie, like Ria, did not, come of age, did not become a lawyer knowing explicitly of Pauli, but obviously Pauli shaped so much of what I could do in the world. And so now Pauli is such a central person in sort of how I live my everyday and sort of how I sort of conceptualize the bounds of advocacy, and this idea too, as sort of both Julie and Ria alluded to, that Pauli's brilliance was manifest in so many different ways, but this idea too that we're always engaging in pushing back on what is possible in our lifetimes, but also having a hope that we will create conditions that will be differently understood in the future. And so that I think is very much part of how I sort of hold Pauli now, which is like, for all the frustrations that we might contend with, for all of the ways we might feel our work or our bodies or our lives are misunderstood, that some of what we're doing is hopefully creating the possibility that at some future time they will take on different meaning, they will take on different possibility, and I think that Pauli really is the beacon of that for me in so much of what I do.
Thank you. Julie, you mentioned the archives and all the recordings. I'm curious and kind of eager to learn if there's anything that stands out that surprised you, a discovery that you made in the course of making this film, digging through that incredible footage and records about Pauli and their life.
Yeah, so it's funny because that's a question that comes up with almost every documentary. Normally, not sure how to answer it. In this case, like, the answer to what surprised us was like every single thing. Like every turn in the development of 20th century legal history where Pauli intersected and was having these revelatory ideas way before anyone else. Every example of activism that Pauli was involved in that, your history books, our history books told us happened later on. I do want to point out that, like, in some, we show in a number of cases with artwork where something that Pauli was doing was way ahead of when you've heard of it. That doesn't necessarily mean that Pauli was the first. Pauli was certainly not the first black person sitting in a section of the bus that was going to lead to arrest and jailing. I mean, if you look through the black press, as we certainly did to get headlines, that was actually something that was occurring with some regularity. Pauli was just someone who was ahead of the curve on so many issues that it was all shocking. I think we also certainly were surprised and pleased to understand how much of Pauli's innermost thoughts that didn't show up in autobiographical writing in lifetime actually did end up in these journals, diaries, and notes that, after all, Pauli was quite intentionally preserving for history. So the thought that Pauli had kind of left this trail not only of a developing intellectual line of thought, but also personal experiences that weren't going to be understood by doctors in the era that these were coming up, going back to the late 30s, but of course are more understandable to the medical community and the public today. Like, it's a huge gift. And as Ria pointed out, actually just listening to this voice, who in our minds, when we first started listening to these audio tapes, and we really listened to everything that there is, only a small fraction of it is in the film, Pauli was someone that was like clearly speaking to be heard and writing to be read, even if it wasn't at that moment. Like, I just feel like you can feel that when you listen to the audio. It's like piercing at you. Like, I have something to say to you. Listen. And I found the experience of listening to that audio really revelatory and moving.
That's incredible. And I love seeing the letters and the nicknames. It was just so intimate and beautiful to see that full life illustrated. I'm going to turn it now to Ria and Chase and talk about Pauli and their work and your work here at the ACLU. You know, Ria, you know, you're following in Justice Ginsburg's footsteps as the director of the Women's Rights Project. Of course, you mentioned your connection to LDF and Justice Marshall. Can you bring us to today and the work that you do at the Women's Rights Project here at the ACLU? You know, you're building upon these just incredible legacies. Tell us more about your work to advance gender equality, particularly for those who are sitting at the intersection of gender and race, you know, what Pauli deemed experiencing Jane Crow.
So I love this question, Eunice. And I just feel compelled to point out that, you know, the Women's Rights Project has actually been doing this kind of intersectional work since its founding in 1972 by both Justice Ginsburg and Brenda Feigen. And I mention that because I think in large part that's due to Pauli's influence on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? Pauli not only was obviously a friend of RBG's, Pauli was a member of the ACLU's National Board of Directors, and Pauli's influence and way of thinking about these intersectional issues really shows up in WRP's docket as early as the 1970s, not in any of the cases that RBG ultimately argued before the United States Supreme Court, which are the ones I think we're all most familiar with, but in really important ways, just a couple of which I think are worth remembering today. One is the wonderful amicus brief filed in Coker v. Georgia. This was the case that asked the question whether the death penalty was lawful for rape. And the brief filed by the Women's Rights Project and other organizations, it just does an incredible job of breaking down why the death penalty came to be used for rape. And it was at the intersection of stereotypes about femininity, about Black male sexuality, about the fragility of white women, and weaves all of those strands together so artfully to argue that, in fact, the death penalty for rape would be unconstitutional, not necessarily a position you would expect a feminist organization in 1973 to take. But of course, the Women's Rights Project was never just a feminist organization. It was a feminist organization within the broader ACLU, and that perspective, which came from other lawyers doing the work, as well as folks like Pauli, really can be seen in some of RBG's work that's lesser known. So I commend everybody to take a moment to read the brief in Coker v. Georgia filed in 1973. It's just absolutely fantastic. Another case from that same era I love talking about involved the forced sterilization of Black women in North Carolina. Again, another case that did not make it to the United States Supreme Court, part of a sort of nationwide eugenics program that really was popular from the I would say roughly 30s to 70s. And targeted people with intellectual disabilities, Black people, and particularly Black women. And RBG and Brenda Feigen together filed a challenge to this program on behalf of a young woman named Niall Cox, who had been forcibly sterilized, essentially after her mother was threatened with loss of public assistance benefits if she did not agree to sign her name to have her daughter be sterilized at age 18. Something that the client only learned many years later when she had married and was planning to expand her family, and she learned she had actually been permanently sterilized many years earlier. So I mention these cases only because it's a sign, I think, of the fact that what we remember about the Women's Rights Project document in the 1970s doesn't necessarily reflect the full complexity of the work, and what we celebrate doesn't reflect the full complexity of the work. What we count as a victory doesn't necessarily reflect the full complexity of the work. And also because, of course, those same issues are the same issues that feminist organizations are contending with today. And forced sterilization, as you all know, has been back in the news recently, both because of allegations at an ICE detention facility in Georgia, as well as the controversy around Britney Spears' conservatorship and the fact that, you know, she's been forced to continue to have an IED to prevent her from having additional children. And of course, the question about criminal legal responses to violence against women, also one that's very current and active conversation in the women's movement today. And the fact that all too often feminist movements sometimes rely on a carceral response, despite the fact that those movements both are not necessarily responsive to the needs of survivors and also disproportionately penalize, Black people and particularly Black men, and are really weaponized in that way. So all this is a long way of saying Jane Crow has actually always been in the Women's Rights Project's blood, and that's very much true today as well. When you look at issues such as the current evictions crisis, something that, evictions affect Black women at more than 3 times the rate of other renters in a typical year. And obviously this has been anything but a typical year. We are profoundly concerned about the impact on families headed by Black women, not just in the coming sort of cliff of evictions, but also what's called the Scarlet E. Once you've been evicted, that can prevent you from obtaining other housing opportunities and even employment opportunities, and really affect Black women much in the way that a wrongful arrest could affect Black men. We also see the tragic over-policing of Black families, another issue that has been more recently dubbed the new Jane Crow when you look at interventions into parenting and into child welfare systems that in the ways that non-Black families are not policed. So these early threads in the work, again, I think very much the influence of Pauli over RBG continue in our docket today.
Thanks so much, Ria. I actually didn't know about some of the early briefs that you mentioned, and I've been here for almost a decade, so I'm so glad that you shared those examples with us. Chase, in the film, you mentioned the connection between Pauli's, pioneering scholarship on the 14th Amendment and the recent incredible victory at the Supreme Court on behalf of Amy Stevens and Don Zarda, which of course Ria was also part of, affirming that federal employment laws do protect LGBTQ people from discrimination in the workplace. I'm wondering if you could help us better understand in, greater detail how Pauli laid the groundwork for that victory and how that will shape future advocacy for LGBTQ people.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's sort of two strains of things that I want to sort of draw out about sort of the way in which Pauli is, as a person and as a thinker, is sort of instrumental in the work that we're doing today on behalf of LGBTQ people and particularly trans people. But of course, the most high profile and salient thing would be the victory at the Supreme Court in the Bostock case, in which the Supreme Court held, affirming, almost, decades and at least one decade of lower court cases, recognizing that federal prohibitions on sex discrimination include prohibitions on discrimination against someone for being LGBTQ. And of course, the body of law builds upon the cases in, the sex discrimination context for at large, which of course was something that Pauli had a huge influence on, as we've been talking about in the context of RBG's cases and obviously the cases, the race discrimination cases as well. So this entire body of federal statutory law around prohibitions on discrimination, particularly in the employment context, which is, the context in which we prevailed at the Supreme Court, but generally sort of applying federal prohibitions on sex discrimination to LGBTQ people, and particularly to trans and non-binary people, is something that, we really could not have done without Pauli's influence on Justice Marshall, on Justice Ginsburg. And that, of course, is law works in this precedential way. And so we're building on this foundation of work over many decades that leads to this incredibly important victory in 2020, sort of ensuring protections for LGBTQ people, not just in the context of employment, but in other contexts where federal law prohibits sex discrimination, including in healthcare, in education, in credit, and in housing, including in shelter. And these are areas where, particularly in this moment, where we're seeing incredibly high rates of unemployment and discrimination in employment, in housing, and in healthcare, that we needed that federal prohibition on discrimination in order to ensure protection for LGBTQ people around the country, because in many states and localities, there aren't explicit protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And getting that Supreme Court victory in 2020 has been, absolutely instrumental for building a continued body of protections for people that we're using, obviously, to protect trans students in schools, to fight back against efforts to punish trans people in athletics, to ban healthcare for trans minors, which is sort of what we're seeing in these anti-trans bills that are sweeping the country. And of course, there is none of that without looking back to Pauli, and not just Pauli, but I think because we sort of credit so much of the development of sex discrimination law to RBG alone, I think we have to look at sort of the role that Pauli played in informing Justice Ginsburg's work, and then of course informing what we were able to accomplish over the last 10 years in the LGBTQ context. I think though, like for me, perhaps, more importantly, or sort of more fundamentally, and this really comes forth in the film, and something that I've been thinking about a lot, is the way in which too, Pauli desired autonomy over Pauli's body. And this idea too, that when you lose access to self-determination in one way or another, and we see this repeatedly where Pauli's trying to understand who Pauli is, and the world is saying, no, you can't be this way. And that actually makes you crazy. And crazy in the sense of like, the world defines what is sort of sane and what is sort of not sane, and the sort of structures of how disability operates in our lives, and what happens when you are fundamentally challenging through your desire to be who you are, how power has historically operated, and then what happens to you. And this, I think the context of Britney Spears is another good example in all of the ways in which people are, stripped of autonomy over their body when they are seen as a threat to power. And Pauli too experienced that very, very deeply. And the history of, sort of casting people as mentally ill and then using the power of the state to constrain their opportunities for survival is a central part of American legal history. And Pauli was also fighting back against that in Pauli's life. And I think now about the way in which trans young people are being talked about, trans young people who know who they are, who want control and autonomy over their bodies and are being told, that you don't know who you are. And we as the state, we as structures of power are going to constrain your opportunities for survival. And I think that we can sort of look at Pauli's life as the exact example of that happening and sort of saying, no, you do not know who you are. You can't love who you want to love. You can't embody your body as you understand it. And there's a long history of, sort of using the power of the state to constrain people's opportunities for survival when they believe that they should have the ability to be who they are. And even, there was, a pathologization of enslaved people who wanted to be free. And there was a whole, psychiatric illness that was conceptualized about, the notion that one's desire for freedom should be pathologized and then punished. And I think that if we look historically at the way in which the law uses disability as a mechanism of pathologization and then enhances the power of the state to punish, that is just as central to American legal history as almost anything else. And the desire, not just for equality, because I think equality, of course, is important, but equality doesn't give you necessarily justice. It doesn't necessarily give you, self-determination in a deeply and inherently violent system of laws. And so Pauli's, fight to be Pauli and to leave the stories of that fight for us is perhaps even more fundamental to the work that we're doing today, even than Pauli's influence on, sort of the equality jurisprudence that we rely upon to build the case law up to the Supreme Court, which is incredibly important. But as Ria noted, that these are deeply violent and intersectional ways in which the law harms people's possibilities for survival, inextricable, of course, from the history of this country as being one that was founded on genocide and chattel slavery, and that Pauli's fight for not just equality, but for self-determination, I think is something that we are continuing today and hopefully carrying Pauli's work with us in everything that we do.
I'm learning so much from listening to the three of you, and I'm reluctant to say that we're at our last question, but I want to bring your expertise and speak to the audience directly for a minute. Pauli's activism started at such a young age and continued as a student, a scholar, a lawyer, a writer, a priest. Pauli lived like 17 full lives and was an activist throughout. We are not award-winning filmmakers or arguing cases at the Supreme Court. Many of us are leading everyday lives and curious about how we can kind of channel Pauli's activist energy. Thinking about the ACLU's body of work, the things that all of you are so grappling with and studying on a daily basis. Julie, I'll first start with you. How do you want people watching this film to engage, to use their voices and efforts? Where do you want that channeled, and where do you think that's most necessary?
Wow. Well, I think there's maybe two very opposite ways one could react when confronted with a story like Pauli's and listening to Pauli's voice. One is to kind of shrivel up and curl up. First of all, there's so much to fight. Pauli, by the way, and this is maybe a deflating thing to say, but Pauli did not want to be an activist and said that a number of times. Pauli felt there was no choice given the obstacles. Pauli wanted to be a writer. And Pauli, if you read the books, Song in a Weary Throat, Proud Shoes, the poetry, Dark Testament, was a brilliant writer and should have just had the opportunity to excel in that sphere. But Pauli felt there was no choice but to become an activist because of the obstacles that were thrown in a life's path at every turn. So you could shrivel up, first of all, because of everything that was Pauli fighting, and also thinking like, well, I'm not that brilliant and I'm not that energetic. Like, I'm not going to accomplish what Pauli was able to accomplish. Or more optimistically, you could take the view of sort of relentless optimism that Pauli took throughout life. Every wall, like, how can we climb over that wall? Or how can we maybe get in a position that the next generation could climb the wall? So I think to me, the biggest lesson from Pauli's lifetime is optimism in the face of every obstacle. And I think adhering to that kind of optimism is probably a good move, because what choice do we have?
Ria, same question to you.
I love Julie's answer, and I actually didn't know that Pauli didn't want to be an activist. And before hearing that, I was thinking about the ways in which Pauli embodied both sort of great activist and great legal mind in one person. And of course, most of us could aspire, in our wildest dreams, to be one or the other, but not both. And when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was tapped to form the Women's Rights Project, she was tapped together with Brenda Feigen, but on the theory that RBG would be sort of the doctrinal force, and that Brenda was bringing sort of the activism of the women's movement, activism that RBG very much credited with creating the conditions in the world that allowed her to win in court. Because of course, judges are people too, and judges are responsive to the world that we live in and the social conditions. And so it was the activism that actually primed the justices to be ready for the arguments that she was making and that Pauli had made. So Pauli is that rare person who combines both of those qualities into one. But since most of us will never be RBG or Pauli Murray, I do think it's helpful to remember that activism actually is what makes institutional change possible. That's what changes the conditions on the ground. And it makes certainly so much of the work that we at the ACLU do in the courts possible. And each of us can be an activist, perhaps not to the same extent as Pauli, but each of us can be an activist in our own lives. And that will have a really profound impact.
Chase, to you.
What I'll say is, I love that Pauli had so many ways of impacting the world, and I love reading Pauli's poetry. And in one of Pauli's poems, Prophecy, there's this line that Pauli writes, that I have been cast aside, but I sparkle in the darkness. And to me, it's so fundamentally queer, to just sparkle. But I think about that all the time, which is, there are so many structural barriers to pushing back on these institutions, to engaging in activism that changes the conditions that we live. But we also have an impact on those around us. We also have an impact on the communities of people, of loved ones that we build. And that part of how we sparkle in all of this, in these incredibly traumatic and depressing moments, is to build our own love, build our own joy. And that's, to me, where I carry Pauli to the Supreme Court, of course, and all the work that Pauli did to get us there, but also in the day-to-day relationships that I form in the communities that we build together, that, we can still sparkle in the darkness. And that, I think, is how I, urge us all to hold Pauli as well.
That's a beautiful note to end on. I want to thank Julie and Ria and Chase for sharing your wisdom and expertise, this beautiful story about Pauli with all of us. I want to thank everyone in the audience for watching, and of course, supporting the incredible work and the important work of Chase and Ria and everyone at the ACLU. So thank you all so much, and have a wonderful day.